I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, our October Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. Who would have thought even a short time ago that two of the big stories in today's newspapers are, one, big news that the governor of New Jersey is not running for the Republican presidential nomination. That is an interesting turn of events, that is a big story. And second, the news today says that heading to the top of the Amazon bestseller books is Herman Cain's autobiography. I mean, we are living certainly in interesting times. Before I proceed, Adam Birkland of Americans for Prosperity wants to make an announcement. Adam, are you at hand? Here you go.
Hey, thanks for the time, Mark. Hey, everyone. My name's Adam. I'm from Americans for Prosperity Foundation. I just want to make a quick announcement. Some of you got a card on your table that's just a little card with information about our upcoming national summit. It's called the Defending American Dream Summit. It's going to be a meeting of top conservative activists in the area. We're going to have some great speakers like Mark Levin. Herman Cain's going to be there. We've also invited all the other Republican presidential candidates. So it should be a great event. It's November 4th to 5th, and we're currently running a discount code. It's a special 25% off the ticket price, and you just enter AFPF25. If anyone didn't get a card and you have any questions, just feel free to see me after. I'll stick around to see the congressman's talk here, and we can chat afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you. In 2011, the Leadership Institute has already trained 8,731 students. And since 1979, through the life of the Leadership Institute, we have trained over 98,932. We're inching towards the 100,000 student mark. You have before you on the tables the school schedule for this year. Those schools that are currently scheduled, we will surely schedule some more to be held before the end of this year. I invite you to take a moment to review our upcoming schools and consider attending one or sending a friend to one of our programs. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Obed Bazikian, who will offer an invocation and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Obed is our intern currently for the Youth Leadership School Department. He's a graduate of Rutgers University with a bachelor's degree in political science. Obed?
Thank you, Morton. Let's bow our heads in prayer, please. Lord, we thank you for this morning. Thank you for another day. God, if there's ever a time we need you in our nation, it is now, God. Lord, I just recite a very known verse, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. God, may we know this love, and when we have that love for one another. Lord, I pray for our government. We lift up our president, Congress, the Supreme Court, state and local governments. Lord, we ask for wisdom. Pray that you would guide them right now to make the right decisions. We say a special prayer for Congressman Huelskamp. Pray that you would bless him and his family. And pray that you would guide him and his staff to do the right thing right now. Lord, we pray for the conservative movement. God, we are not perfect, but we are trying to do what we believe is the right thing to do. And we ask for wisdom, God. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, if my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will turn and hear from heaven and forgive their sins and heal their land. God, we humble ourselves right now. I know I'm not perfect. Lord, we ask that you would forgive us. Heal this nation, God. We thank you. And lastly, Lord, we thank you for the food that we ate. Remember those who don't have any food right now. Provide for their needs. In Jesus' name, amen. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ovid. Reciting that prayer would be perhaps a capital offense in Tehran, Iran this morning. It's now my pleasure to present to you Brittany Morit. She'll give us a report on Leadership Institute programs. She is Communications Manager for campusreform.org, which is the Leadership Institute's grassroots mobilization site for conservative college students. For brief remarks, Brittany.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to give a brief update regarding campusreform.org, as Morton said, the grassroots mobilization website for conservative student activists throughout the country. And we have continued to see sustained growth this month, particularly with our field representatives traveling around the country, working with conservative students. In the past couple of weeks, we've had some very notable stories. First, there were students at Northern Arizona University who wanted to remember 9/11 by passing out American flags. Sounds like a great idea, except for the administration didn't seem to think so. They harassed the students for hours and eventually shut down their event. Luckily, Stephanie, one of our field representatives, was there with the students and caught it all on film. Within hours, she published the story on Campus Reform and posted the video, which was then picked up by Drudge Report, The Blaze, and the students were then invited to speak on Glenn Beck's show about what had happened. The video now has more than 17,000 views. Then, just a few weeks later, a young field representative, who is also a reservist in the National Guard, was working with students in the University of Minnesota, and while he was on Duluth's campus, he was passing out free pocket constitutions to celebrate Constitution Day. A young man and young woman who happened to be Black Panther supporters, and one was also the chair of the College Democrats, decided to harass him for handing out the pocket constitutions. And they said they would exercise their Second Amendment rights against him, and that they didn't believe in the Constitution. He also caught this on film. Though maybe the most unbelievable part of this story is that an administrator was standing by and watching the whole thing and said nothing. This story was also published on Campus Reform and picked up by outlets such as The Blaze. The video has now more than 99,000 views. Another project that we would like to announce we're very excited about is our Rules for Radicals project. We've taken Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and recognizing that political technology is philosophically neutral, we made video guides, 13 individual video guides, posted them on Campus Reform to show conservative students how they can take Saul Alinsky's tactics and use them to benefit their student organizations. So we encourage you all to visit www.campusreform.org, and you can find me after the breakfast. I can give you that website as well, and read up on these stories, check out the video guides, and tell us what you think.
Thank you, Brittany. The next honor I have is to present to you Robert Arnakis, who will introduce our truly outstanding speaker. Robert is Senior Director of Domestic and International Programs for the Leadership Institute. He oversees our division, which provides political education and training to thousands of people each year. Robert.
Thank you, Morton. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be with everyone today, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Congressman Huelskamp was elected to the first United States Congress in November 2010. He currently represents Kansas 1st District. Congressman Huelskamp was born and raised in Fowler, Kansas. Congressman Huelskamp has attended seminary in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and pursued a bachelor's degree in social science at the College of Santa Fe. While pursuing this degree, he worked as a budget and legislative analyst for the state of New Mexico and taught at public and private high schools. He has remained active, a volunteer with disadvantaged youth. After his undergraduate education, Congressman Huelskamp accepted a scholarship to pursue his doctoral studies at American University. In 4 years, he obtained his PhD in political science with a specialization in agricultural policy. During his time at American University, the congressman met his wife, Angela. Together, they have been assisting women with crisis pregnancies. Additionally, Congressman has been busy as a college instructor teaching public policy and as a statistical analyst. Upon graduation, the congressman and his wife decided they'd return home to Kansas to farm and ranch. Prior to entering Congress, he was elected to the Kansas legislature and the Senate, and he served 4 terms there. It is our pleasure today to welcome one of the dynamic members of the freshman class of 2010, excuse me, Congressman Huelskamp.
Thank you for the introduction, Robert, and I will give you credit. There's not many folks that can pronounce my last name correctly, and but it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Morton not only for the invitation, hopefully you'll thank me when I get done speaking for being here, but for your leadership, Morton, and helping train folks like myself. So I've spent many an hour at an LI workshop, mainly doing receiving the training, done a little training myself, but it's just a distinct honor and pleasure to be here this morning and join you. Let me work on this microphone a little bit. It's okay. Trying to. Yes, sir, I am doing that, so we'll work on that. So, okay. Yeah, and I'll ask in the back if you can't hear me. I'm going to continue to speak up. But again, thank you for having me here this morning. I am one of those pesky freshmen, and I'm pesky not only to the left, but oftentimes our leadership as well. But I get asked the question as a freshman. I go home and I have a district in western Kansas. It's about 2/3 of the state, one of the most rural districts in the country. It's about the 10th largest district. And I've conducted 69 town halls. And I always get the question, said, Huelskamp, is Washington everything you thought it would be? I said, oh yes, and much, much worse. And I tell you, this morning I'm going to tell you some things that tell you, well, we've got a lot of work to do. But I'll tell you some things I think we're making progress on. But if you want to know about me, you heard a little bit about my background, but the reality is I'm just a farm kid from a little town of 500 people called Fowler, Kansas. And I'll just say, the idea that a young man, a kid from out in the middle of nowhere, can end up in Washington, D.C., representing a congressional district, that's pretty amazing, and the folks that know me think that's probably pretty amazing I made it. But I tell constituents, I'm glad you come to a town hall, because in most parts of the world, if you would show up and want to tap your congressman in the chest or any other type of politician, you'd be met with a rifle butt. But here in America, we do have that opportunity and responsibility to get engaged. And I got a couple staff with me here that my Chief of Staff, Jim Paff, my Press Secretary, Karen Stewart. I introduced them for a number of reasons, but in today's America, and the technology that I learned at LI and the way to engage folks is the way I try to run a congressional office. To engage and bring people in so we can not only represent a congressional district, but actually hopefully change the rest of America. And, but again, I'm going to touch on a few topics this morning, and I'll say up front, if you have any questions as we go through, I'll try to pause. Feel free to interject and interrupt, and that's the way I conduct town halls, and I want to do the same. But let's start, if you could cue the video and a little issue I've been working on right now.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
A lot of folks on the Democratic side who were very supportive of Obamacare said, you know, when you find out what's in this health care proposal and now this law, you will really like it. But now we know in like a 25 or 30-page regulation that the Department of Health and Human Services will, for the first time, mandate that all of this critical private health care information of yours and mine is available and in the possession of the government.
Congressman Tim Huelskamp, who's of Kansas, he's a Republican, and he is saying that what Kathleen Sebelius, the Health and Human Services Secretary, wants to do is demand that the insurance companies submit detailed health care information about their patients directly to Washington, or at least give it to the 50 states. And Dr. Siegel, the first thing that jumps out at me is, what about patient-doctor confidentiality? Why does Uncle Sam get to see what my doctor knows about me?
Well, absolutely right, Megan. By the way, he's right. It's in the Federal Register right here that this is exactly what HHS is planning. And I think it's going to add another layer of bureaucracy between the doctor and the patient. I think it's going to be a potential violation of patient privacy. And I'm even more concerned about this terminology that's in there: mitigate impact of potential adverse selection and stabilize premiums. You know what that means?
What does that, no, what does that mean?
That means they're going to try to control premiums, control prices, look at who's sick, who isn't, try to keep everything controlled. More bureaucracy.
Pretty shocking. And you might not have heard much about that. And I'm in the midst of trying to make certain all America knows what's going on. What we feared about Obamacare, is beginning to happen. It is already taking place. A rule was issued back in July. A Kansan was in my office, that was probably about 3 weeks ago. Came in and wanted to visit about that. We didn't know about it. No one else was talking about it. Came in and said, I want to let you know. This was an individual in the insurance industry, and said, we're worried about this rule that would require our raw claims data be submitted to Washington, D.C., or to your state capital, which means Kathleen Sebelius, who is called the most powerful woman in America by one conservative publication last year, which is absolutely true, she will have access, or to her lieutenants will have access to know when you went to the doctor, to know what your prescriptions are, to know what happened in your medical history 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We're receiving evidence that perhaps they're already assembling this database. This would be the single largest database in the history of this country. And without a doubt, I believe they'll probably mess it all up. But the point is that we were promised in Obamacare, of course none of us in this room believe that, we were promised in Obamacare that told your relationship with your doctor, you won't have to change your health care plan, you get to pick your own doctor. The point is, you won't even be able to keep your own medical records private. And the left has been talking about this again and again in privacy. It was a state issue in Kansas in an AG's race. But here we have this administration put together a rule that would create a national database. Why do they need this data? Well, they need to determine if you're a health risk, and if you're a health risk. Because they're going to, under Obamacare, they're going to subsidize the insurance companies that insure sick people and tax the ones that insure healthy people, which is why supposedly they need everybody's health care records. The point is they do, they want it. It's also a part of this IPAB, Independent Payment Advisory Board, which will make a determination of where they're going to cut $500 billion out of the Medicare system over the next decade. What concerns me as a conservative is that, have you heard much about this? You have not. as a freshman, as a candidate, and as did every other Republican candidate, essentially said, when I get to Washington, we're going to vote to repeal Obamacare. First week, we certainly did. Woohoo, we passed it, went to the Senate, they said no. That's done. We got that off the agenda. That's what we hear. But the point is, there's another way to take care of Obamacare. And this is an issue most Americans agree with us on. They do not want Obamacare to be the law of the land. And then they hear things like this. Trust me, you will not find a single person, unless they work in Washington, some agency said, well, yes, I want Kathleen Sebelius to have my health care records. But here today, in the House, also in the Senate, we have Republicans that, we've done our job, we can't stop it. We can stop it. We can take their money away. And if Kathleen Sebelius is going to create a national database or a state-level database that will be tied to her office in every state, we need to stand in the way and stand up. And in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to continue to push leadership, as I continue to do on many issues, saying, hey, if you're really serious about Obamacare, taking it down, take the money away. If we go through another election cycle, and I think we'll have a different president, but if they have already created the database and rolled that in place in 50 different states, the idea that we're going to come in and undo that, if we can't stand up and stop it now, it's going to be very difficult. So Obamacare is continuing ahead. Repealing it in 2013, folks, is not good enough, even if we did it then. But I am very concerned, and as a Kansan, I must admit, Kathleen Sebelius is what we gave to America. And the most powerful woman in America, because she will have your medical records, your parents' medical records, to make decisions about who will qualify for treatment in future years. That's my fear as well. So the regulation's underway. We brought this to the nation's attention last Monday. The deadline for submission of comments, I think, was Tuesday. And when we started talking about this on that Monday, they extended the comment deadline for 30 days, I believe. And so there's additional time to put comments in. We're pushing hard on this. The administration is denying the creation of a database. But, of course, they also say, well, don't worry. Your data is in safe hands. Ask that the 26.5 million veterans that had their data lost on September 14th. The thousands and millions of Americans that have seen their data lost under Medicaid. Even the president himself, remember in 2008, a bureaucrat over at the State Department was going through his own travel records. And the point is, we can't trust Washington with our data. We can't trust them with our health care. And we need to stand in the way. So that's one thing I'm working on. I want to let you know about it, because this really shows a difference between Republicans. There's some Republicans that say, hey, I'm going to say the right thing. And then there are some Republicans that say, hey, no, we're going to continue to do something about it. And we're going to continue to fight on this and deal with Obamacare. Second thing I want to talk about is today in the Washington Post, it was indicated I had joined a new caucus here in Washington. It's called the Apocalypse Caucus. And I think I'm very happy to be a member of the Apocalypse Caucus. But the point being is I'm one of a few Republicans that voted no against the continuing resolution in March, voted no on the debt debacle bill in August, one that voted no on the CR, continuing concurrent resolution just this week. And the Washington Post reporter said, well, now, Congressman, if that had not passed, the world would have fallen apart. Apocalypse would have been here. Washington would have shut down. And they wanted to bait me in and say, well, it was good to shut down Washington, which actually I'll say is probably a darn good thing, but I wasn't going to say that at the Washington Post. But the point being, let me tell you, this really shows a difference, I think, amongst Republicans. And I'm not saying everybody needed to vote this way, but it really shows a difference. I sit on the House Budget Committee, and as a new freshman, I didn't know how the process works, and maybe many of you don't, so I'll explain that. Every member of the committee gets 5 minutes to ask questions of witnesses. We had Mr. Bernanke. It's a tough microphone. Mr. Bernanke was before the committee. Mr. Geithner was before the committee. And I asked my staff, maybe we'll just take that out. Yep. Thank you. Okay. I apologize. I should have done that earlier. So, yeah. Okay. I was in the budget committee, and we have numerous conferees. Mr. Geithner, I actually wanted to ask if he had paid his taxes. Do you recall Mr. Geithner, the head of the Treasury Department, didn't pay his taxes? Can you imagine if a conservative Republican, well, we wouldn't even know about him anymore because he wouldn't have been nominated, plus he wouldn't have been confirmed, running our IRS. And I wanted to ask that question. Staff said you probably better not. But we had 4 economists there one day, and they're lined up, and you had a conservative economist and a few moderate, conservative, in name only probably, and a pretty liberal economist. And I said, you know what? And we were talking about the debt crisis here in America. And I said, I'm just a farm kid from Fowler, Kansas. Just give it to me straight. How much time does America have left? How much time does America have left? And the first economist, he said, you know what? He said, act like you have no more time. This was in a public hearing. Well, that's about what I expected from the conservative. But the other 3 economists, they said, you know what? We agree with the first guy. Act like you have no time left. And when we talk about budget, and when we talk about borrowing money, when we talk about a debt ceiling, when we talk about a continuing resolution for the rest of the year, one thing that makes me different and a few other conservatives is this concern, this sense of urgency, because it is urgent. And you have a lot of my colleagues, and this is the difference, where they're saying, you know what, we're going to take care of that problem, but you know what, we'll do it after the next election. From what I hear from economists, folks, is that may not work. We may not have that much time left. And when you're borrowing $4 billion every day, $1.5 trillion for the entire year, and we get told by some folks in this town, just, you know what, we'll take care of that about January 2013. We're going to really fight then. We're going to take care of that budget issue. Point is, we can't continue to borrow at this rate. And folks say it, but there will come a point in time, and it's going to come more quickly than most folks in this town think, there won't be an ability to borrow money. We'll hit that debt ceiling, as they say, perhaps when someone continues to or refuses to loan us the money. But $1.5 trillion a year. And when we had this debt ceiling debate in the House and in the Senate, was kind of debating, which is arguable. As one of my colleagues said, they need to kind of do the fog test on the Senate, kind of put a mirror underneath them and see if it'll fog up and see whether they're even breathing over there in the Senate. Do you realize the Senate has taken about 100 votes this year, most of them naming post offices? The House has had over 700 votes. We've debated every issue of the day. And the Senate, the mainstream media, allows them to get by with that. That's one thing to talk about. 889 days since the U.S. Senate passed a budget. But the point being, at least the House is talking about it, but we're not getting done. But the critical difference, I think, between conservatives and the rest of the Republican Party is this issue of urgency. Can we continue? How long can we go on at the same rate? And who was it? I think it was a former majority leader. And I heard this last night, and I'm trying to recall. He said, you know what? He said, we put off doing the right thing now so we can win an election, so we can put off doing the right thing later on. Think about that. We're not going to do the right thing now because we're going to get to it later on. And I hear that over and over, particularly on the budget issue. That's how you can end up $1.5 trillion in debt. And people are saying, you know what? The U.S. House, we cut $352 million in April. And our leadership said, you know, that's a big victory. $352 million out of a $3.5 trillion deficit. We have a lot of work to do on the budget, because I really believe the issue is urgency. How much time do we have left? So we're going to continue to push on that. Most of Washington is not ready and willing to make those changes, but as Morton mentioned to me, as bad as things are, people are starting to recognize it. 69 town halls. I come from a fairly elderly district, and it's mainly retirees that are able to show up when they have a town hall. There's 69 of them. Why are you doing so many town halls? I like doing those. I like going home every weekend. I want to be outside of Washington. Have you ever had a job where you hate to go where you work? Yeah. I love my job, but I hate where it's at. It's in Washington, D.C. And I think that about that. So I go home every weekend, talk to 69 town halls, talk to constituents, and you give them a few facts and figures, and they look at me and they say, you know what, that's kind of what I figured. I figured Medicare was going to be bankrupt in 7 to 19 years. I figured Social Security was going to be gone in a generation. But you know what? No one was telling me that. But you know what? I knew that, and I want to do something about it. We talked about some Medicare changes in the House that would suggest that we make changes if you're 55 and younger. I had how many people that were 60-year-old folks coming to me and say, you know what? Why am I exempted from the changes we need to make? I'm ready and willing to do that. But most folks in Washington say, hey, nobody wants to make those changes and sacrifices. But I think they're ready and willing to do that when you talk about it and you give them the truth about our situation. The truth is you can't borrow $1 trillion a year. The president's budget for the next decade would borrow another $1 trillion more every single year. And I sure hope I'm proved wrong on this, but sometime between now and $25 trillion of debt, the end will come from our ability to borrow that. And every day we put it off and put it off. Another election we put it off. So I'm really afraid that as we're saying now in the Congress is wait till January 2013. Gosh, we'll have the president, we'll have the Senate and the House. Then we'll say, you know what? We didn't get 60 votes in the Senate. So wait till 2014 election. Wait till January 2015, and then I promise you, then we'll really do something. And on the budget, we don't have till January 2015. I'm afraid we don't have anything. We can't wait till January 2013. Which, by the way, January 1st, 2013, you know what happens? The President of the United States, President Obama, wins the tax argument. How does he win? Does the House fold and pass a major tax increase, pass the Buffett rule and those kind of things? No, here's what happens. On January 1st, 2013, if nothing passes on tax issues in Congress, if the president signs nothing, on January 1st, 2013, the single largest tax increase, not only in American history, but in human history, becomes the law of the land. Because every one of the Bush-Obama tax cuts expire. All the Obamacare taxes kick in. Numerous other extenders that we've passed on for 10, 15, 20 years, specific things, they all kick in. If we do nothing. Trying to convince my colleagues and convince the American people and convince our Republican friends, most conservatives get it, if you do nothing, you lose, which is not anything new. I served in the state legislature, and one day Nancy Harrington was a colleague of mine. I was still a freshman, and still thinking we could really get something done. And it was, and we were about ready to walk on the Senate floor. I said, "Hey, Nancy, I'm going to offer this pro-life amendment." You know, and we always kind of 20-20. We'd win one, lose one. It was really close. And she said, "You know, it's Friday afternoon, Tim. I mean, you know, gosh, do we really have to have this fight today? Because we're just going to lose the amendment." I said, "Well, you know, Nancy, I want to be strategic, and I want to do it the right way." I said, "But, you know, just because we're not fighting does not mean that we're not losing. Just because we're not fighting doesn't mean we're not losing. If we're not fighting, if we're not challenging, if we're not taking them on colleges, college campuses, the left is winning. They win because of what they've set up. Here in Washington, if you're not fighting, they are adding $1 trillion a year. And being a member of the apocalyptic caucus, the idea that, boy, if you stood in the way and said, we're going to change things, that somehow it's a bad thing. That's what we don't want the left to convince us. What we don't want the folks, so-called moderates, to convince us is that sitting back on our heels and saying, hey, you know, it's going to take care of itself. It is not. Which story brings me to the last issue I want to talk about. During my campaign, I had a tough primary of 6 or 7 opponents, and it was grassroots activism and a history that helped win that race. But when I looked at the polling, and I am strongly pro-life, 100% pro-life, I have 4 adopted children, and I'll just say the children don't look like me. I'm one of those Republicans that doesn't quite look Republican. I have 2 adopted girls from Haiti and a couple of boys from here in this country, so I care very deeply about the issue of life. But during the polling, during the campaign, the 7th most important issue to my constituents, our primary Republican primary voters, was the issue of life. The issue of life, almost last on that. But amazingly, even though that issue, the same way all across the country last fall, amazing, even though the issue ranks so low, out of 87 new freshmen, you have about 80, I would say, that are solid on life issues. That's because we are winning that battle in the Republican primary. We say if you have to be for life if you want to win. But the point is trying to translate that into making a difference here in Washington, D.C., trying to defend, currently in America today, taxpayers give $300 million to the largest abortion provider almost in the entire world except for the country of China, the Chinese government. We give Planned Parenthood $300 million. That should stop. And if any Republican congressman says, you know what, I can't do anything about it, the Constitution is very clear. It's the Congress that funds things. If we don't put the money in there, they're not going to get the money. And so the House has passed and voted, said we're going to defund Planned Parenthood. But when we went to negotiate with the president, they threw that one away, said, no, you can have the money. We said we're going to defund Obamacare, talked a little bit about that. Nope, we're going to give that one away. EPA and regulations, we said we're going to defund the EPA. Well, we kind of threw that one aside as well. And what concerns me as a Republican specifically is that the American people, they're starting to get that. They're starting to get that. It's kind of like the old Mark Twain story, and by the way, he's rumored to be my 12th cousin, probably to everybody in this room. But Mark Twain, he once said, do the right thing. He said, do the right thing. He said, it will gratify some people and astound the rest. You know what? I wish Congress, and I try to do the same, I wish they would just try to astound the American people and do what they said we'd do. Do what we said we'd do. We said we'd vote to repeal Obamacare. We said we'd take on the EPA. We take on regulations. And this fall, you'll see that on regulations. We're going to have up or down votes on regulation after regulation in the House. Great idea, great PR, but it's going nowhere. But if you really wanted to take them on, you take away their money. You take away their ability to do things. You tell Kathleen Sebelius, you're not having my personal medical records. And we're going to put a proviso in there to make sure you can't do that. That is doable. It's just whether you're willing to stand up to the president and the administration, whether you're willing to be committed. And the same thing on life issues. If you're willing to stand up for life, don't give them the money. If you're willing to stand up for traditional marriage, remember 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. As most Americans know, it's marriage between as my 5-year-old daughter said at the time, marriage is between a boy and a girl. Exactly. It's pretty simple. Don't give them the money. If the military is going to continue to do that, we have a requirement today that are soon to be implemented that military chaplains of whatever your faith will probably be required to perform gay marriages. How do we stop that? Oh, most Republicans, well, gosh, I can't do anything about that. That's the it is us. It's called the budget. And so the budget is where most things revolve. If you can't get any bills through, which they're not going to happen, you take away their money. And that's my concern, is the complacency in Washington, the lack of urgency, and the lack of desire to follow through and astound the American people by doing exactly what you promised to do. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of pushing to do. I sit in the Republican caucus and I listen in there, and in summary, here's where we're at, and then we'll take your question, is the idea that we're going to be in prevent defense. If you be really quiet, as one of my colleagues said last night, if you be really quiet and don't tell anybody, don't do anything, we're going to beat this president. But just don't talk about anything. Don't fight on anything, because the polls are showing us that we're ahead. That is the message. And that is the message to lose the battle. That is the message to give up the battle. And that's why I appreciate the work of Morton and many others here at LI, is taking the language of the left, taking the strategies, taking the technology, and going out and convincing folks that we have the answers. It's our principles, conservative principles, that's going to win the day. And we're not going to win the day by hiding it under a bushel basket, but being the shining light on a hill that says, hey, we have the answers and we're not afraid to talk about them. That is why, one last thing, the Tea Party scares the holy heck out of Washington, D.C. That's the worst thing you could think of, because it's people out there that don't buy the line that you can't do it, that think the Constitution's important, plan on keeping the Constitution important, and plan on holding Republicans accountable as well. Republicans are pretty darn scared about Tea Party as well, because they don't get their messages from Washington, D.C. And it's amazing. I've spoken Tea Party rallies for many years. It's just average, ordinary Americans standing up and say, hey, you know what? This is our country, and we're going to take it back. And it is making a huge difference. It's scaring the heck out of people in this city. We need to continue to do that, and we're going to continue to fight on that. So I know I've gone on way too long on the first part. I want to open it up for questions and comments and going back and forth. So yes, sir.
What do you expect from the super committee in November?
What do I expect from the super duper extra special super duper committee? Not much. And let me tell you why. If the committee does nothing, what happens? Nothing. Why? Because all the cuts they're talking about are, let's be clear here, as we expect, it's all cuts in the rate of growth. But all the cuts that they're going to do, none of them will occur before the next election. Nothing. So who's going to do it? It's going to be the guys down the road. That's the person that's going to make the cuts. It's the next president, it's next Congress. Actually, some of the cuts that would occur, that you hear even some of the, I think the DOD, there's some groups over there, and we want a strong defense. The cuts that would happen in the Department of Defense, most of those might be 2 presidents from now, 8 or 9, 10 years from now. I'm sorry, if you can't cut $353 million last spring out of a $3.5 trillion budget, these folks aren't going to cut anything. So I think the Super Duper Committee is going to come up with a recommendation. They may or may not, but the point is that if they do nothing, we'll have the sequestration, and all those cuts are all after the next election that someone else will have to deal with. Most Kansans I talk to say, no, you got to deal with it now. And that's the only cut that counts, is the one you make now, not the one in the future. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Congressman, is there going to be any action by Congress to overturn or to intervene in the regulation, the blatantly anti-religious freedom regulation that the HHS has put out, that would mandate that Catholic colleges and Catholic institutions have to fund abortion in their health care?
The question was about another HHS rule, and they come out every day, and I'm as a Catholic, that's particularly insulting to me as well. What is Congress going to do? Probably nothing. And the regulatory process is an administrative process, but the way you handle it is you go in the budget process and you say, Kathleen Sebelius, you cannot do that. And so we have the authority to say, thou shalt not issue that regulation, which is a mandate and violation of the conscience of every healthcare provider. And but I don't see any push. There's just a few of us talking about that, but you got to put a proviso in the budget. And here's the question. I always get asked, as a member of this Apocalypse Caucus, you're willing to shut the government down to defund Obamacare? You're willing to shut the government down to take the money away from Planned Parenthood, or to take the money away from this healthcare database, or take the money away from this violation of conscience? Let's look at the left, the other side. The president is probably willing to shut the government down in order to protect his position. He is willing to do that. In our Republican caucus conference, are you willing to? The left sometimes, far too often, I'm not talking about people in this room, seems more willing to stand for their principles than we are. So I would say on this issue, our conference would be more than willing to give it up, because we'll deal with it sometime in the future.
Just by way of historical reference, if you want to try to put any backbone into them, one of the last things at the end of the Bush administration, HHS, had put out some very good regs to get at fraud and abuse in Medicare and Medicaid. And Congress, in the very last days, overturned those regs. So there's precedent for Congress intervening in HHS regs. And you might tell your colleagues that if you want to try to put some backbone into them.
Well, yes, thank you. And there are only 2 ways to deal with that. One is a budget proviso. The second one is once used in 15 years method by which the House and Senate has an up or down vote to disapprove a regulation, but then the president has to sign the disapproval. That's only happened once, but that's allowed under the law in a 1996 law. Yes, sir, the gentleman.
One of the biggest problems on the House side is the Appropriations Committee, where we see, I believe, the gentleman from New Jersey who routinely kills defunding sort of amendments on the floor. How do we target as activists the Appropriations Committee on the House side and really put pressure on those Republicans? My former Congressman, Marsha Blackburn, sponsored 2 amendments that would defund the government by 1% and 5%, and they were killed on the floor by Appropriations Committee members.
Yes, the appropriations process is served in the state legislature as well, and folks, it's it's usually about the money. It really is, and that's how we set priorities. This is where you have your values and principles articulated. So it's about the money, which is why the appropriations process is very closely controlled. When I came in January, the Speaker of the House, this is what he told the conference, this is what he told the world. He said, we're going to open that process up. And you might remember in, what was it, in late January, early February, where the House had a 3 or 4 day debate on the floor. We had 100 different amendments, everything under if you want to bring down an amendment as a freshman, you got to do that. I am where I want to be. That is never, ever going to happen again. There will not be another appropriations bill. Everything's going to be written in the committee. It's going to be written in the back room, and that is a leadership decision. A decision to close that down. I just read about it this morning. There will be no more opportunities. We had that opportunities on 6 out of 12 appropriations bills. And as we left in August, on August 1st, as we left, there was an appropriations bill still sitting on the House floor, right in the middle of debate. And that's it. We are not going to have another appropriations debate. And that's a choice of leadership. And I think it's the wrong choice. I think we need to err on the side of openness. We need to be more transparent. We need to allow those debates so the American people can see there's a difference. And oh my gosh, there was a huge difference. You saw that. And so to me, it's closed down, and it's a leadership decision, and it's pretty clear we will not have another appropriations bill till probably January, February, March of 2013, which was our opportunity to take on Planned Parenthood, to take on this issue of conscience, take on the EPA. I had an opportunity to offer an EPA amendment, and I've been talking about the EPA as a farmer myself, and throughout the campaigns for years about how bad they were. I said, okay, so I'll take their money away. I had a little amendment that would take $3 billion away from the EPA. $3 billion, man, more than enough. $3 billion was kind of where I thought, okay, maybe we could get this passed. And I'm going to give the Democrats credit here because they all voted 100% almost against the amendment. Hey, at least they're consistent. It only received 130 votes, which meant you had about 100 Republicans that voted to not take away money from the EPA. 100 of them. So, well, we have a recorded vote. On one hand, you said you're worried about regulations, and we're going to you'll hear about it on the floor this week and next week and the week after that, the EPA this, EPA that. They're devastating regulations. We'll take their money away. Well, we couldn't do that. And so that amendment failed. At least be consistent. Yes?
Howard Wooldridge. Once upon a time, I rode my horse from St. Joseph, Missouri to St. Francis across US 36 in your district. Met a lot of nice people. Thank you for all that guest-friendly people over there. My question concerns our nation's 40-year running policy of war on drugs, drug prohibition. My profession has spent about $1 trillion now chasing the Charlie Sheens and Willie Nelsons of the world. And for all of that, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, in their pamphlet states, drugs are readily available to America's youth, unquote. My question is, going forward, I realize $1 trillion isn't so much money anymore, but as a nation, should we double down and spend another $1 trillion for a policy which makes drugs readily available to America's youth? Would you sponsor any type of change in direction? The federal government spends about $15 billion a year on enforcing prohibition. As far as I can see from this pamphlet, money all wasted. What would you do differently?
That's a great question, and not one I've thought much about. I live along Highway 54, which is a direct route in New Mexico, and the violence that accompanies that. I mean, folks on our side agree and disagree on how we're going to handle that. But I think what it envelops to me, and again, I don't want to answer the question because I really haven't thought too much about it when the nation's bankrupt. But what I do say, what it brings to attention to me is that frustration I have is, we can talk about all kinds of things down on that hill. We can even pass things, but fundamentally, if we don't get the issues of culture and character correct, if we don't protect families, it's an issue. If a family can't convince a kid that's a really stupid idea to throw your life away, it's really hard for government to do that. And so it's a battle of culture and character, and that's one thing we can't let the left and the folks in our party say, hey, don't worry about it. You know, that is core to what we do and what we believe. And so that's a character issue. And I do have folks stand up to me and say, hey, you know what, Tim, I think our character's gone, that no matter what we do, it's just too late. And I can't take that as a ready answer, but it could be a possibility. Yes, sir.
When I talk to this on, when I talk to my clients in my financial planning practice and we discuss a $1.6 trillion deficit, I don't think the clients get their arms around it. They might think that we have $100 trillion in revenue coming in, and we're spending 1.1 or 1.01. But what they really don't realize is that we're bringing in $2.2 trillion in revenue, and we're spending 3.8. We are spending 30% more, or 70% more than what we're bringing in. And I think that message needs to get across.
It is unsustainable, and to me, of urgency, and for our Republican folks that say, hey, we're going to deal with it later. When you're borrowing 41 cents out of every dollar, that is unsustainable, and there's a real concern that it can't even last for another year or two, or 12 months, 18 months.
Another question.
Gentleman in red sweater there.
2012 is going to be the 20th anniversary of the signing of the UN Rio Declaration on Sustainable Development, Agenda 21. What conversations are taking place to prevent this? Because we know Obama is, next year when that celebration occurs, he's going to be right in line with the UN. Where do you stand on American sovereignty, private land rights? Are those conversations taking place?
No, those conversations are not taking place. I haven't heard much about them. We continue to hand over money to the UN. And again, it's a very, very small portion of our budget, but anything given to them is, I think, a real threat to our sovereignty. But again, there's not much discussion about it. But to me, the bigger issue is this issue of borrowing $1.4 trillion. You know, the Chinese, these folks, they don't agree with us on a darn thing. We owe them about $1.4 trillion, and they expect to be paid back, and that has an impact on our domestic policy, whether as well as our foreign policy. There's a little country over there called Taiwan. We signed a little agreement a number of decades ago. We defend them from the Red Chinese. You think you go into our banker and say, hey, could you loan me $250 billion to defend the Taiwan from your invasion? That's not going to take place. And so what we do impacts our sovereignty, because we're over a barrel. And so that was the issue when they talked about raising the debt ceiling. It was really, will we let the Chinese bail us out again, or any other country? So we're going to borrow in the next year and a half, we're going to borrow another $2 trillion from folks that don't care what we think. And so if the UN comes to us and says, or China comes to us and says, hey, you got to sign on to this, which is what happened when I had one of the top leaders in China was before a budget committee preaching to us about what we need to do on our budget. This was 2 weeks ago, sitting across the table. Said, what kind of world have we become where they can walk in here and tell us what to do our budget process? The point is they were right, but gosh darn it, I'm not going to have them tell me what to do. As American, we've really changed, and that's a real threat to our sovereignty. Was there one more question over here?
Yes, you talked about the Republican House having an opportunity to have an impact by taking away the money, and I believe you're correct in saying that, because I think we can control a lot by taking away the money. And then we had an opportunity in the House to do some of those things with EPA and so forth, and we backed away from those opportunities. We're apparently showing that we have a reluctance to actually exercise that ability to have an impact. So my question to you is, what's it going to take for the House to have the backbone and spine to actually act like conservatives and exercise the power that they do have?
I think it's about elections, and it's about pressure now as well. And you know, I don't want to put off things to January 2013. I think it might come to a head before then. And but it has to do with folks getting involved, elections, getting involved and complaining. Our Speaker of the House, he indicated just the other day, actually yesterday, he said in his 21 years, he had conducted one town hall. Now, I don't want to be critical of what people do politically, what they do home in their district, but if you aren't out every day talking to your voters, your constituents, the people you claim to represent, how do you represent them? I think many of my colleagues, and I saw this when we changed the congressional schedule, where 1 week a month we're supposed to be out of town, thank goodness. What my colleagues talked about on a Friday or Thursday before they left town, and when they came back 10 to 12 days later, that was as different as night and day, because they went home, and if they were listening, they got an earful, and then they came back and they acted differently. So if they aren't listening, I mean, then we'll have to wait till election, but we got to continue to show up. And many of my Republican colleagues do not have the type of town halls, do not have the open place where they can listen. That's how we heard about the Sebelius rule. Somebody came in the office and were actually listening. That's part of leadership. You got to sit down and listen instead of telling them what to do as well. So I think I appreciate the time, Morton. I think that was the last question. We'll be hanging around here for a little while longer. And but I want to say I just want to thank Morton and for his leadership all these years, making a difference. It makes a difference in Kansas, which is about as far away as you get from Washington, D.C., thank God. And it's making a difference at the state level, the county level, and the city level. Because if people get involved, if you get involved, if you go back home and you say, hey, I'm going to make a difference. You might run for the legislature, you might not win. But going and sticking up for conservative principles, because very few people are speaking up in America today. And this is one place that's making a huge difference. So thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to join you this morning.
Thank you so much, Congressman. We really appreciate what you are doing. You're standing up for principles as a token of appreciation. I want to present to you a set of Adam Smith cufflinks. Thank you. And I want to tell you that my wife is sorry that she couldn't join us today. It now turns out she was doing her patriotic part to increase Catherine Sebelius's national database, because she has a doctor's appointment this morning. I invite you all to join us on Wednesday, November 2nd. Our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast guest speaker will be Dr. Matthew Spalding of the Heritage Foundation. He is a brilliant and accomplished author, and I know he'll have a great message for us. I'd like to invite anyone interested in a tour of the Institute and our addition next door to meet with David Talbot here at the lectern after breakfast. David, where are you? Step on up here, and if you want a tour of our facilities, David's your man to do it. If you are interested in buying any Adam Smith attire, neckties, cufflinks, scarves, whatever, see my assistant, Kathy Graham, up on the 4th floor. Thank you for coming.